What happens when one of Hollywood's most charming leading men walks into what he thinks is a friendly late-night interview, only to discover the host has prepared an ambush that will destroy his reputation on live television? The answer will shock you, and by the end of this story you'll never look at talk show interviews the same way again. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because this confrontation gets absolutely brutal. The backstage area of Jimmy Kimmel Live was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. Hugh Grant sat comfortably in the guest chair, reviewing his talking points with his publicist while sipping on a cup of tea. He had done this routine hundreds of times before, promoting his latest romantic comedy to Jimmy's audience of millions. What he didn't know was that Jimmy Kimmel had spent the entire week preparing something completely different. Earlier that afternoon, Jimmy had received a phone call from a disgruntled former assistant who had worked on Hugh's latest film set. The assistant, bitter about being let go, had fed Jimmy a series of increasingly dramatic stories about Hugh's alleged behavior behind the scenes. Stories about tantrums, impossible demands, and cruel treatment of crew members. Jimmy, always hungry for content that would generate buzz, had decided to make these unverified claims the centerpiece of tonight's interview. As Hugh made his way to the stage, the audience erupted in their usual warm applause. He waved graciously, that familiar boyish smile lighting up his face as he settled into the guest chair opposite Jimmy's desk. The host's grin seemed wider than usual, almost predatory, but Hugh attributed it to pre-show excitement. Hugh Grant. "Everyone," Jimmy announced to another round of applause. "Always a pleasure to have you here. Now I have to start with something that's been making the rounds in Hollywood lately. There are some pretty interesting stories coming out about your recent film shoot. Care to address some of the allegations about your behavior on set?" Hugh's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the opening they had discussed in the pre-interview. His publicist had briefed him on light questions about the romantic comedy, his co-stars, and maybe a funny anecdote or two about filming in London. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Jimmy," Hugh replied carefully, his British accent lending an air of politeness to his confusion. "The shoot went quite smoothly, actually. Lovely cast and crew." Jimmy leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something that looked suspiciously like malicious glee. "Really? Because I've been speaking with some people who were there and they paint a very different picture. Multiple sources are telling me you were, shall we say, difficult to work with. Demanding. Some even used the word abusive." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the playful banter they had come to expect from Jimmy's celebrity interviews. Hugh felt his chest tighten as he realized he was walking into some kind of trap. "Jimmy, I think there might be some misunderstanding here," Hugh said, trying to maintain his composure while his mind raced. "I pride myself on professionalism, and I've never had complaints about my conduct on any film set." "Haven't you, though?" Jimmy pressed, pulling out what appeared to be printed emails from his desk. "Because I have documentation here that suggests otherwise. Reports of you screaming at catering staff, making impossible demands about your trailer, and at one point apparently throwing a script at a junior assistant." Hugh's face went pale. None of this was true, but the way Jimmy was presenting it, with such confidence and apparent evidence, made it sound credible to anyone watching. "Those allegations are completely false," Hugh said, his voice becoming firmer. "I don't know who you've been speaking with, but they're lying. And frankly, Jimmy, I'm surprised you'd ambush a guest with unsubstantiated gossip." Jimmy's grin widened further. He was clearly enjoying this. "Ambush? Hugh, I'm just doing my job. The public has a right to know what their favorite actors are really like when the cameras aren't rolling. And according to my sources, you're not the charming gentleman everyone thinks you are." "Your sources," Hugh repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "And who exactly are these sources? Are they willing to go on record? Because I'd be very interested to face my accusers directly." "You know I can't reveal my sources," Jimmy replied smugly. "But I can tell you that multiple people, independently, have come forward with remarkably similar stories about your behavior. That suggests a pattern, don't you think? Hugh felt his famous temper, the one he had worked years to control, beginning to flare. The injustice of the situation, being ambushed on live television with lies and half-truths, was almost unbearable. "What I think," Hugh said slowly, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "is that you've invited me onto your show under false pretenses. We discussed a completely different interview format, and now you're trying to destroy my reputation based on anonymous gossip." Jimmy laughed, actually laughed, as if Hugh's distress was amusing to him. "Come on, Hugh. Don't be so dramatic. I'm just asking tough questions. Isn't that what good journalism is about?" "Good journalism?" Hugh's voice rose slightly, causing several audience members to lean forward in their seats. "Jimmy, you're not a journalist. You're a talk show host who's apparently decided to play prosecutor, judge, and jury all at once. And you're doing it based on information you can't even verify." The host's expression hardened. This wasn't going the way he had planned. He had expected Hugh to either break down and confess or stumble through weak denials. Instead, the actor was fighting back and fighting back hard. "I don't need to verify anything," Jimmy snapped, his carefully constructed television persona beginning to slip. "I have reliable sources, and frankly, your defensive attitude is pretty telling. If these stories weren't true, why are you getting so upset?" Hugh stared at Jimmy for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. The polite, diplomatic mask fell away, replaced by something much more dangerous. "You want to know why?" "I'm upset, Jimmy, because you're using your platform to spread lies about me to millions of people. Because you violated every principle of basic decency and professional courtesy. And because you're clearly enjoying it." The tension in the studio was now palpable. Even the camera operators seemed uncertain about whether they should keep rolling. Jimmy's producers, watching from the control room, were frantically trying to figure out how to salvage the situation without making it worse. "I'm enjoying doing my job," Jimmy said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "If that upsets you, maybe you should think about why these stories exist in the first place." Hugh stood up slowly, his full height imposing even in the relaxed setting of the talk show. "No, Jimmy. Maybe you should think about what kind of person uses their television show to attack someone based on unverified gossip. Maybe you should think about what that says about your character, not mine." Jimmy's face flushed red at Hugh's words. The host was clearly not used to being challenged so directly on his own show, especially not by someone calling out his methods in front of his audience. "Sit down, Hugh," Jimmy said, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're being ridiculous. I'm asking legitimate questions based on credible information." "Credible information?" Hugh remained standing, his voice carrying across the silent studio. "Jimmy, you haven't presented a single piece of credible information. You've made vague allegations from anonymous sources and presented them as fact. That's not journalism, that's gossip-mongering." Jimmy slammed his hand on his desk, causing his coffee mug to rattle. "Don't lecture me about journalism. I've been doing this for years. I know how to vet my sources." "Do you?" Hugh's voice was ice-cold now. "Because if you had properly vetted your sources, you would have discovered that I've never thrown a script at anyone, never screamed at catering staff, and never made unreasonable demands about my trailer. In fact, I don't even use a trailer on most shoots. I prefer to stay in character by remaining on set." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word of this unprecedented confrontation. Several people had their phones out, clearly recording what was happening. Jimmy's confidence was visibly shaking. "Look, Hugh, maybe there were some misunderstandings, but the pattern of behavior that's been reported to me suggests..." "What?" Hugh interrupted, his British accent becoming more pronounced as his anger grew. "That you're willing to destroy someone's reputation based on hearsay? That you think your television show gives you the right to act as judge and jury?" "I have every right to ask tough questions," Jimmy shot back, but his voice was getting higher, more defensive. That's what separates real interviewers from the softball lobbers. Hugh laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the studio. Tough questions? Jimmy, tough questions are about craft, about choices, about the work itself. What you're doing is character assassination based on fabricated stories. They're not fabricated, Jimmy yelled, losing his composure entirely. I have sources, real people who worked with you. Then name them, Hugh demanded, stepping closer to Jimmy's desk. If these sources are so credible, if their stories are so true, then have the courage to name them. Let them face me directly instead of hiding behind your desk like cowards. Jimmy's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He clearly hadn't expected Hugh to call his bluff so directly. You know I can't do that, Jimmy mumbled. Can't or won't, Hugh pressed. Because there's a significant difference. If you can't name them, it's because they don't exist. If you won't name them, it's because you know their stories won't hold up to scrutiny. The host was sweating now, his carefully styled hair beginning to stick to his forehead. You're trying to intimidate my sources. I'm trying to defend myself against lies, Hugh corrected. And the fact that you're more concerned about protecting anonymous gossips than about the truth tells me everything I need to know about your integrity. Jimmy stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the wall behind his desk. Don't you dare question my integrity. I've built my career on honest reporting and fair interviews. Fair interviews? Hugh's voice rose to match Jimmy's volume. You call this fair? You ambush me with unsubstantiated allegations, refuse to provide any real evidence, and then accuse me of being defensive when I dare to fight back? You're the one making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be, Jimmy accused, pointing his finger at Hugh. A simple denial would have sufficed. A simple denial to complex lies? Hugh shook his head in disbelief. Jimmy, you've spent the last 10 minutes trying to convince your audience that I'm some kind of monster based on stories you can't even verify. Did you really think I would just sit here and take it? The two men were now facing each other across the desk, both clearly furious, their voices echoing through the stunned studio. The audience looked like they were watching a car crash in slow motion, unable to look away but clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. You know what your problem is, Hugh? Jimmy said, his voice dripping with venom. You think, because you're some big movie star, you're above accountability. You think you can do whatever you want and nobody should question it. My problem? Hugh's laugh was harsh and humorless. Jimmy, my problem is that I trusted you enough to come on your show, only to discover that you're willing to sacrifice basic human decency for ratings. My problem is that I believed we were going to have a professional conversation, not a public execution. Jimmy's hands were shaking now, whether from anger or adrenaline. This isn't an execution. It's an interview, a real interview, not the puff-piece promotional garbage you're used to. Real interview? Hugh's voice was deadly quiet now, more dangerous than when he had been shouting. Jimmy, a real interview involves research, preparation, and respect for your guest. What you've done tonight is ambush journalism at its worst. I did my research, Jimmy insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Did you? Hugh challenged. Because if you had done real research, you would have spoken to the actual producers of my films, the directors I've worked with, the co-stars who know me professionally. Instead, you chose to listen to anonymous sources with questionable motives. Jimmy's face was now a deep shade of red, and sweat was visible on his forehead under the studio lights. You don't get to come on my show and tell me how to do my job. I'm not telling you how to do your job, Hugh replied calmly. I'm telling you that what you've done tonight isn't journalism, it's harassment. And frankly, it's beneath both of us. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible. Even the production crew seemed frozen, unsure whether they should intervene or continue recording this unprecedented meltdown. You want to know the truth about sources? Jimmy said, his voice cracking slightly. Sometimes you have to trust people, even when they can't go public. Sometimes you have to be willing to ask the hard questions that nobody else will ask. And sometimes, Hugh replied, his voice steady and controlled, you have to have the integrity to verify your information before you use it to destroy someone's reputation on national television. Jimmy's breathing was becoming labored, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he struggled to maintain any semblance of control. The host looked around the studio wildly, as if searching for support that wasn't coming. You think you're so much better than everyone else, don't you? Jimmy spat, his voice becoming increasingly erratic. Walking around with that perfect accent, that charming smile, acting like you're royalty or something. Hugh's eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. Jimmy, this isn't about superiority. This is about truth versus lies. You've made serious accusations against me without any credible evidence. I don't need evidence, Jimmy exploded, his voice echoing through the studio. I know what kind of person you are. I've heard the stories for years. What stories? Hugh demanded, his voice cutting through Jimmy's hysteria like a blade. From whom? When? You keep making these vague references, but you can't provide a single specific detail. Jimmy's hands were gesturing wildly now, his movements becoming more frantic. Everyone knows, Hugh. Everyone in this town knows what you're really like. Everyone. Knows what, exactly? Hugh's voice was deadly calm, a stark contrast to Jimmy's growing hysteria. That I show up on time? That I know my lines? That I treat crew members with respect? What exactly does everyone know, Jimmy? The host was pacing now, moving back and forth behind his desk like a caged animal. You're twisting everything around. You're making me look like the bad guy here. Jimmy, you are the bad guy here, Hugh said quietly, his words carrying clearly through the silent studio. You invited me onto your show under false pretenses, ambushed me with unverified allegations, and when I defended myself, you became abusive and erratic. I am not abusive, Jimmy screamed, his voice cracking. I'm doing my job. I'm asking the questions that need to be asked. No, Hugh replied, his voice remaining steady. You're having a breakdown on national television because someone called you out on your unprofessional behavior. Jimmy stopped pacing and stared at Hugh with wild eyes. Get out, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Get out of my studio right now. Hugh didn't move. Jimmy, I think you need to take a moment and consider what you're doing. You're destroying your own credibility in front of millions of viewers. I said get out, Jimmy screamed, pointing toward the exit. Security, get him out of here. Several confused-looking security guards appeared from the wings, clearly uncertain about what they were supposed to do. They looked back and forth between Jimmy and Hugh, waiting for clearer direction. Gentlemen, Hugh addressed the security guards calmly, I'm happy to leave voluntarily. There's clearly no point in continuing this conversation with someone who's having an emotional breakdown. Don't you dare psychoanalyze me, Jimmy shrieked, his face now purple with rage. You don't know anything about me or what I've been through. Hugh began removing his microphone pack, his movements deliberate and controlled. Jimmy, I don't need to know your personal history to recognize unprofessional behavior when I see it. What you've done tonight is beneath the standards of any legitimate television program. This is my show, Jimmy yelled, his voice becoming hoarse. My show, my rules, my questions. Yes, it is your show, Hugh agreed, standing up and straightening his jacket. And you've just shown everyone exactly what kind of show it really is. The audience was completely silent, many of them looking shocked and uncomfortable. Some were still recording on their phones, capturing every moment of this unprecedented meltdown. You're finished, Jimmy screamed as Hugh began walking toward the exit. Nobody will work with you after this. I'll make sure of it. Hugh paused and turned back to face Jimmy, his expression one of genuine pity. Jimmy, the only person who's finished here is you. You've just demonstrated to millions of viewers that you're willing to sacrifice your integrity, your professionalism, and apparently your mental health for what you thought would be good television. Get out! Get out! Get out! Jimmy was chanting now, his voice breaking with each repetition. Hugh turned to address the stunned audience directly. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this. I came here tonight to talk about my work, to entertain you, and to have a pleasant conversation. Instead, you've been subjected to what can only be described as a professional breakdown. Jimmy threw his coffee mug across the studio, where it shattered against the wall. Stop talking to my audience. This is my show. Not anymore, Hugh said quietly, but his words carried clearly through the studio. What this is now is a cautionary tale about what happens when someone with a platform decides to abuse it. The security guards finally moved, not to escort Hugh out, but to position themselves between him and Jimmy, clearly concerned about the host's increasingly erratic behavior. I want him arrested, Jimmy screamed, pointing at Hugh with a shaking finger. He's threatening me. He's intimidating me. One of the security guards spoke up, his voice calm and professional. Sir, Mr. Grant hasn't made any threats. He's been completely peaceful throughout this entire exchange. Jimmy's eyes widened as he realized that even his own security team wasn't supporting his version of events. You're all against me. Everyone's against me. Hugh shook his head sadly and walked toward the exit. As he reached the edge of the stage, he turned back one final time. Jimmy, I genuinely hope you get the help you clearly need. This isn't about me or my reputation anymore. This is about your well-being and the well-being of everyone who works on this show. Don't you dare act like you care about me, Jimmy screamed, his voice echoing off the studio walls. This is all your fault. All of it. Hugh disappeared into the wings, leaving Jimmy alone on stage, still screaming at an audience that was now filing out in shocked silence. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of the host's complete psychological collapse. The security guards were now actively restraining Jimmy, who was trying to follow Hugh backstage, still screaming incoherently about conspiracies and betrayal. Turn off the cameras, Jimmy was yelling. Turn them off. This isn't supposed to be happening. But the cameras kept rolling, documenting the complete destruction of a television host's career in real time, all because he thought he could ambush one of Hollywood's most respected actors with lies and gossip. So there you have it, the most shocking talk show meltdown in television history. What do you think pushed Jimmy Kimmel over the edge? Was it jealousy, pressure from the network, or something else entirely? Drop your theories in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more incredible Hollywood stories that you won't believe actually happened.